eh? Yes. Well, good morning, colleagues. I understand that some people are experiencing some difficulties this morning, mainly because the red line of the metro is experiencing some problems. But I think that we do have a good quorum to start the session. So without too much ado, let's start. Good morning, colleagues. And I would like to use this opportunity first to welcome all of you to this session. I'm quite happy to see representatives from different institutions and countries participating in this event. So, my name is Patricio Marquez. I am a lead public health specialist at the Health, Nutrition and Population Global Practice of the World Bank. And also I co-coordinate the Global Tobacco Control Program here at the World Bank, along with my colleague Blanca Moreno-Dawson, who is the organizer of this event. Certainly it's an honor, and I'm very happy to moderate this event, especially taking into account the caliber of the members of the panel. And also I would like to use this opportunity to welcome our colleagues that are participating via webcast in this session from different countries of the world. And I would like to invite all of you to follow us in a conversation using hashtag no tobacco and hashtag tax for the debt. If you allow me, I would also like to use this opportunity to express publicly our support, our appreciation to the support that has been provided to us by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the Bloomberg Philanthropies, for advancing the global taxation work here at the World Bank. And we are doing that as a multi-sectoral activity, bringing together specialists from public health, macroeconomics and finance, governance, trade, and customs. So in that way, we are able to address the different dimensions that tobacco use pose in terms of challenges at the country level. Also, I would like to inform you that, especially for the presentation by our colleague from Uruguay, we are going to have simultaneous interpretation. You can access the Spanish channel, channel 3. So then you can be able to hear him make his presentation. Having said that, let me use this opportunity as well as a preamble to state categorically at the onset of the session that there is irrefutable scientific evidence nowadays. It's no longer a cause and effect relationship, a simple association, but a cause and effect relationship between tobacco use and ill health, premature mortality, and disability. We are dealing with a product that kills. Therefore, one of the things that we are advocating from a public health platform is tobacco taxation in order to make these products unaffordable and protect the population from the negative impact of cigarettes that have very high direct and indirect economic costs on individuals, families, communities, and society at large. besides the public health benefits of tobacco taxation, colleagues, as we are going to see in the different presentations during this panel, taxing tobacco can represent an important source of domestic resource mobilization that could be used, as we are going to be seeing in different countries, to finance priority investments and programs for the benefit of the entire population. So, tobacco taxes kill. Tobacco taxes are a win-win, not only for public health, but also for fiscal revenue mobilization. And this has been accepted and is starting to mainstream on the basis of the framework of the recently agreed Financing for Development Action Agenda that was approved by heads of states and high-level representatives of countries in the Addis Ababa Third Conference for Financing for Development that was held in July 2015. And later, colleagues, this provision was fully endorsed in September 2015 at the United Nations General Assembly as a key instrument that underpins government's commitment to mobilize domestic resources in order to help finance sustainable development goals. So that's the overall context of the discussion that we are going to have, and that complements the discussions that took place yesterday as part of the other panels, in which the key message was we need to find ways to help mobilize resources to finance priority investments at the country level. So now I would like to use my prerogative as the moderator of this panel to invite, and actually it's an honor, to invite Professor George Akerlof to offer his perspective on the economics of manipulation and deception, on taxing to promote public goods, and including tobacco taxes. Professor Akerlof, as most of you may know, is the 2001 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his pioneering work on on the asymmetries in the marketplace. And actually, his piece of work on the market for lemons was cited by the Nobel Academy or the Nobel Committee as the reason why they were awarding him with this distinction. So now let's join me in welcoming Professor George Akerlof to the podium.
So, thank you, Patricio. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So, Bob Schiller and I have written a book entitled Fishing for Fools. Let's see, where are we? Entitled Fishing for Fools. This is the book. It actually has a very good cover. So the cover may be the best thing in the book. It has a wonderful cartoon by Ed Koren. You may know who Ed Koren is. He's the person who makes fuzzy animals in the New Yorker. And maybe you can see what the cover looks like from there. So I'm going to give you a 10-minute synopsis of the book. So the most fundamental concept in psychology is that we humans are machines. We humans are machines that are prone to error. Now, some of our decisions that we make as these human machines are bad for us. Now, the job of the psychologist is to figure out how those errors arise. That is, to ferret out our psychological weaknesses that cause us to make those bad decisions. In contrast, the fundamental tool of economics is the concept of equilibrium. The nature of that equilibrium is the following. If there's a profit to be made in free competitive markets, people will seek out that profit. Now, it turns out that's a powerful notion, and you can see it every time you arrive at the checkout counter at the supermarket, because, as you may have noticed, it's always surprisingly difficult. It's surprisingly difficult to choose the best lane. Why? Because there's an equilibrium with all the lines of approximately the same length. So there's an insistent equilibrium. It's a powerful notion. Okay, so now let's do a synthesis of these ideas. Putting together these two concepts from psychology and from economics yields the following result. In free market equilibrium, if we have some weakness, it will be exploited as long as there's a profit to be made. Now, all economists know about the well-known problems of pollution and bad distributions of income, but this is further reason why just letting people be free to choose yields bad incomes. Why? Because free markets not only allow us to be free to choose, they also allow others to tempt us into choices that are profitable for them, but they're not good for us. Now, free markets may be, in fact, they probably are, the source of the economic cornucopia of developed countries, but they're also a playing ground. They're a playing ground for fishing for fools. So what do we see? In 4 major areas, free markets tempt us in 4 we could not possibly want. I'll give you those. Most people, number 1, most people, even in rich countries, go to bed at night worried about how to pay the bills. Number 2, periodic financial crashes result from the sale of bad financial securities that people have leveraged themselves to buy. 2. 3, ill health. Our food contains too much salt, fat, and sugar. And worst of all offenders is the topic of this session, which is cigarettes. 4, finally, free markets undermine democratic government. How does it do so? As those who run for office collect money from the interest and use that money to attract the voters back home. So each of these could not possibly wants automatically occur. They automatically occur with free markets, and they do so as long as there's a profit to be made. And the important point here is that this is an equilibrium. You're going to find all of these things in equilibrium, just as you find that you always have to look carefully to select the lane at the checkout counter. Okay, so let me give a summary of what we have so far. Thus, in significant ways, the sellers play to our weaknesses. Fishing for fools is no happenstance. It occurs automatically. It occurs automatically as an equilibrium, as I said, as natural as the equalization of the checkout lines. So that's the first message of the book. Now I'm going to take you to another message. So as the book goes on, another message gradually arises, and that's actually a very important lesson for economics. So, there's also a more subtle message regarding the basic reason why we are tempted. This consideration is absent from standard economics. It concerns the basis of our decisions. We humans, the way we think is we think in terms of stories. So everybody here in the audience and everybody here on the panel, just think about it. Each of us sitting here is telling ourselves a story. And that determines how we do, what we're going to do while we're here. And then an hour later, we're going to go out and we're going to be telling ourselves another story. So we have all these stories that we tell ourselves. To a great extent, our decisions are determined by those stories. Let me give you one example. The goal of advertisers is to get you to graft their stories onto the story that you're already telling yourself. So as the book progresses, there emerges the importance of these stories that people are telling themselves. And this adds a new dimension to economics, and it adds a new dimension to economic policy. In contrast, what does standard economics do? It imposes a story on people. What is that story? That story, which is reined in from 30,000 feet, says the following. It says we make this assumption of what those little people are doing down there. It says people do what's good for them. So the best example of a story that's not like that in the book concerns tobacco. So let me give you just one aspect of it. On the one side are the advertisers. For the example, the advertisers promote the story. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. That's a story. Or reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet. That's another story. The advertisers get you to graft their story onto yours. Why? So you will do what's good for them, but needs not be what's good for you. In that case, what are they doing? They're fishing you for a fool. So, let me talk about stories in economic policy. So there's another role for stories, and here the clearest example of all, again, comes from tobacco. So the US government, in a magnificent feat of economic policy, purposefully created a story. So the 1964 Surgeon General's Report on Smoking and Health is a magnificently written and well-researched report. So what did it do? It created a story. The report is 404 pages long, but it can be summarized in exactly 3 words. Smoking is stupid. And that story has been remarkably powerful. I'll give you 2 examples. So when the lawyer John Banzhaf brought a complaint to the Federal Communications Commission that anti-tobacco should have free airtime to counter the harm of tobacco advertising, it was surprisingly granted. When the anti-tobacco movement pointed out that non-smokers indoors were being denied their freedom to choose, the state of Arizona passed a ban on indoor smoking. In both cases, there was a backstory. The backstory was that smoking is stupid. In fact, you may have seen it as you arrived here this morning. So world bankers are banned from smoking inside, and so what you will see typically when you arrive at the World Bank is you'll see some people outside puffing their cigarettes. Now notice this. So as they smoke, they avoid the gaze of all of us who are passing. Why? Because those smokers know what everyone who passes is not saying. This is what we're not saying to them, that they're risking their lives for a pleasure that's not worth it, because smoking is stupid. So with the smokers wearing their dunce caps in this way, the story of the Surgeon General is being passed on. And that's okay. So I've only 1 minute left. And of course, smoking should be taxed, and it should be taxed very heavily. It should be taxed up to the point where the tax is considered excessive and therefore loses its legitimacy. So tax is a win-win-win-win. So win 1 is it discourages smoking. That improves public health. According to the CDC, 20% of US deaths are currently due to smoking. Win 2, it raises tax revenues, and those tax revenues can be used elsewhere. Win 3 is it reduces health care costs, at least the health care costs of those who are going to get cancer from smoking. And win 4, it saves lives of fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, friends. I'm sure that most of you in the audience have your own list of sadly lost friends. So we should be taxing smoking. But also, this comes to the end, we should not forget the role of stories about the harms of smoking. And we should not forget that these stories are as much a part of the economic policy as the taxes that we have. Because such stories, furthermore, when we talk about taxation, such stories are what makes such taxations legitimate, because those stories are what makes those taxes, in fact, collectible. So, thank you very much.
Well, after Professor Akerlof's presentation, it's very clear that our story after this panel is tax in order to prevent people from being a fool and a smoke. So now, to further move, creating the context for this for the discussion in this panel, I would like to invite Professor Philip Cook from Duke University to address us on the accumulated public health and economic evidence that has been generated over the last couple decades that justifies the use of taxation, both for tobacco as well as alcohol, as a demand-curbing instrument that's good for public health, but also for revenue generation. So, Professor Cook, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, everybody. And under Patricio's encouragement and guidance, I am going to try to perform the unnatural act of giving an academic talk without PowerPoint. And we'll see how it goes, but perhaps we can follow along the old-fashioned way. Let me start. First of all, I agree entirely with what George Akerlof has just said, that smoking is stupid, that we should tax the hell out of tobacco. But stepping back from that and talking about more generally excise taxes on tobacco and also on alcohol, let me suggest that high excise taxes of that sort are really not an attractive revenue option unless they are effective in reducing abuse levels and that in particular improving public health. And that furthermore, the effectiveness of taxes in improving the public health is not intuitively obvious. And in fact, there's a great deal of resistance to the idea that this would be an effective measure. Why do I say that this is not an attractive tax option if it's not effective in the public health? The answer is the old-fashioned answer, that these taxes tend to be highly regressive. They place a burden on poor people who continue to drink or to smoke, and often are disabled in various ways because of their drinking and smoking. And so for those reasons, it would not on the face of it seem fair to be asking them to pay a high tax and high prices and with all of the consequences that are associated with it, unless there's some tangible benefit that is being generated by that. Now, it could be that responded, and certainly I've heard this, is that in fact it is fair for example, the drinkers to pay, that if they're the source of externalities, of negative externalities, then they should be compensating the public by paying higher taxes, regardless of whether there is any public health benefit. But I myself do not find this in a particularly attractive notion of fairness, especially if, as I say, it's more like an illness rather than a choice that is being made. So that becomes the setup for saying the evidence on this issue is crucial to judging the normative value of these taxes. Do they, in fact, have an effect on the public health? And if not, then I would be leery about moving in this direction. I got into this in about 1978, and I will say that at that time, it was not just the public that was skeptical of the idea that higher taxes would influence alcohol abuse or smoking. It was also the experts, the people who were recognized as experts at the time. In the area of alcohol in particular, the people like me who started talking about taxation were labeled neo-prohibitionist. The notion being that we had failed to learn the lesson of the prohibition in the United States, which had been an utter failure in that story along the way. It's not the right story about prohibition, but anyway, that gives you a flavor. Furthermore, the view at the time, around 1980, was that, in fact, the problem with drinking is alcoholism, that alcoholism is characterized by addiction and loss of control, and that almost by definition, these addicts will find a way to sustain their heavy drinking, regardless of what the price is. After all, this is a group that tends to be sustaining very heavy personal losses already, losing their family, losing jobs, and so on. And as in George's book, becoming more and more isolated in many cases. How could it possibly be true that a group like that would then be influenced by an extra 10 cents a drink on alcohol? So that the conclusion would be, and I heard this often, was higher taxes is going to be an imposition on a group that already has very difficult lives. It's going to make them more difficult. And so that was the basic setup. The counter argument, I think at that level could be, yeah, there's a lot of intuition to that view of things about alcoholism, but in fact, alcoholism is not the same thing as alcohol harms, that the social harms associated with excess drinking is very much associated with drunkenness, the injuries and crime that come out of it, the domestic violence and all of the rest of it are associated with inebriation, but inebriation can be from people who are not addicted and usually is, especially young men, for example. A second response would be that drinking is a social activity, and so that if we can change the norm around drinking by higher prices, that will affect the upper tail of the distribution. Sociologists have done some very interesting work about how that distribution of drinking tends to be coherent, and if you move the mode, you can move the tail along the way. So that's an interesting thought. And that finally, at the time when I got into it again, around 1980, remarkably, there was some experimental evidence coming out of alcohol treatment centers where they set up token economies with alcoholics and discovered that, in fact, they were responsive to changes in prices as established in that. So that the notion that addiction means inelasticity turns out to be a false connection. Well, what I realized is that there was no need to speculate about all this, that we had in the United States, the laboratory of the states. Thanks to the 21st Amendment, each of the states goes their separate way when it comes to alcohol control and taxation. And we, in fact, had what amounted to trials in a natural experiment of scores of states in particular years changing their tax rate on beer or on liquor, and we could see what effect that had. So that was what I started doing in my early studies of this, is to do this kind of natural analysis of the tax changes as a natural experiment. And I looked, first of all, at tax-paid sales and found, sure enough, that they were going down when the tax went up. You could object that there's a lot of tax avoidance that might be going on in that connection, people going across the state border to buy, or perhaps making their own or going to the bootleg sources. And so that's not entirely persuasive. The second outcome that I looked at was the mortality rate associated with liver cirrhosis. Long a clear marker to alcoholism and to chronic heavy drinking. And it does not have this tax avoidance issue associated with it. And what did I find was that, in fact, a higher tax actually had an immediate effect on the death rate from liver cirrhosis, that it turned out that this group was really quite responsive to higher taxes. The subsequent literature in the 35 years since then, by me, but many other economists and public health researchers, has established the direct connection between tax changes or price changes on the one hand and a variety of adverse outcomes associated with drinking, including injury, mortality, violent crime, sexually transmitted diseases, domestic violence, and so on and so forth. There's some connection to education, and you know, whatever you might think of as being an alcohol-related problem, it is possible to do this kind of study, and often finds the clear evidence of a direct effect through higher prices. I did an analysis, for example, of the 1991 federal law in the U.S. that doubled the beer tax and found the first year it saved 7,000 lives from injury reduction. All right. So the current situation is, I think that as a result of this kind of stream of research, the experts are no longer saying that price is irrelevant. In fact, that there has been a very broad embrace on the part of the health experts around the world on this, and that based on very similar evidence, there has also been a wholehearted embrace of tobacco taxation as a public health measure. The problem is that the politicians and the public are still being left behind on this, and still are back having intuitive objections to why it couldn't possibly be true that addicts are going to be affected by slightly higher prices. And what we've seen is, in the case of alcohol, that since 1991, there has been no action on the part of Congress. The beer tax that was doubled in that year has now slipped back, thanks to general inflation, to very near the level it was at in 1990, so it has been repealed by inflation. That meanwhile, the states have done very little in this area as well. Between 2000 and 2010, only 6 states changed their beer tax, and in most cases by a trivial amount along the way. So it's been pushed off the agenda for lack of a strong political movement, and of course in the face of resistance from the industry. The story on tobacco is entirely different. That since the Master Settlement Agreement in the U.S. in 1998, there has been an extraordinary flowering of state and federal taxes on tobacco products. Between 2000 and 2010, 47 states raised their cigarette tax, and 25 of them raised it by more than $1 a pack. During that time, and we'll hear more about this, the federal excise tax increased from 24 cents to $1.01 a pack. And so that has been a bonanza in terms of revenue, but it's also been a bonanza in terms of public health. The difference is that we don't have a master settlement agreement in the area of alcohol that removes the industry from a politically effective role. That's what happened in tobacco, and it's made a huge difference. It's interesting, and just to say, there are other ways in which alcohol and tobacco are different besides the politics associated with them, and interesting to think about it. Certainly, there's a different public health goal, where for tobacco it's clearly abstention. Without a doubt, there's no safe dose of tobacco along the way, whereas alcohol moderate use is seen as fine and maybe in some circles even as healthy, and so that it becomes a more complicated story. And that creates one of the continuing backlashes against the idea of alcohol taxation, which is that it's punishing everybody, including those who are drinking at a healthy level, for the sake of the relative few who are abusing alcohol, and that's just not fair. It's interesting to do the math on that. I looked at what happens if we had a 10-cent a drink increase in the alcohol tax in the U.S. The result is, of course, the third of the adult public that abstains would pay absolutely nothing. Most others drink so lightly that it would be a matter of just a few dollars a year for them. And only the top 10% of the adult public would begin to look at a serious hit on their budget. They consume 75% of all alcohol in the U.S., incredibly concentrated. And the fairness of it, but also the Pigovian correction comes from the fact that it's that group that also accounts for most of the alcohol-related damage that is associated with it. So almost everybody is better off financially if we raise the alcohol tax, if we distributed the revenues on a per capita basis, that everyone would come ahead financially, except for this very small group at the top. And for them, they get the benefit of a strong incentive to cut back on their drinking, to bear less costs. To the extent that that is effective, and of course I believe it is, the result is going to be that our insurance rates would come down, as well as having tax revenue. So everyone is going to benefit from that, and we'll have a safer, greater public safety from crime and a variety of other benefits. So it really does seem what used to be called the free lunch, where all but a few are going to be benefiting, and those few will benefit directly to the extent that they cut back, which they will. So my conclusion about taxes then is that the end justifies the means in this area. The means are somewhat problematic due to the regressivity associated with it. But the ends of improved public safety and public health in both tobacco and alcohol, in fact, are important, and there is this close, now well-established link between taxation and those outcomes that justify raising the taxes. So I'm with George. All right.
Well, thanks, Professor Cook. I think that the one key message, if we are going to increase taxes in order to increase prices, we have to increase to a level that make those products unaffordable. As we have heard from Professor Cook, and we have found this in many different countries, is that if we are not mindful about the affordability index, and we continue to increase or to adjust in accordance to inflation, then some of the expected benefits will not be generated. So I think that he clearly illustrated this point, and that's something that from a policy point of view, that's something that's important when designing this type of tax measures. So we have heard both from Professor Akerlof and Professor Cook that there is, I will say, a broad agreement among leading economists about the importance of using taxation as a critical public policy instrument. In this case, in order not only to generate the health benefits, but also in terms of mobilizing additional revenue. So that's the context. But as all of us know, the transformation occurs at the country level. So within that context, now we move into the second part of the session, and I would like to invite the four panelists that are here to present individual country experiences about how each of those countries went about applying this public health measure, this public policy measure, what were the impacts, and what are some of the lessons. So let me begin with, and it's an honor again, to introduce Jason Furman, who is the chairman of the U.S. President Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. Jason.
So thank you so much, Patricio, for organizing this. Thank you, George and Philip, for those excellent comments. George's comments were drawn from a book which had the advantage of having an excellent cover and the disadvantage of having a price. My comments are drawn from this, which will be on the Council of Economic Advisors website later today for free. If you ask anyone in the United States, the most important thing that President Obama did for public health, or some people would take the opposite perspective, they'd all agree that it was the Affordable Care Act, the most significant public health milestone in decades. The single most important thing that President Obama signed into law for public health that most people have no idea that he actually did sign into law was a tobacco tax increase, increasing the federal tobacco tax from 39 cents a pack to $1.01 a pack, signed into law in 2009 as part of a plan to pay for the expansion of Medicaid for children. This step saved an estimated 15,000 to 70,000 lives per year, or will save that. It's progressive, and it helped finance an important progressive goal in itself. Even with this increase, though, we're still nowhere near the optimal rate of tobacco taxation, and President Obama has proposed further increasing the tobacco tax to $1.95 a pack, importantly, harmonizing the tax across a range of tobacco products and using this money to pay for early education for all, steps that would eventually save 10 to 50,000 lives per year. These tax measures complement what's been done on the regulatory side, most importantly, giving the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate tobacco, just like it could regulate any other substance. That in the Affordable Care Act, making health insurance companies provide tobacco counseling and treatment for free, and including smoking cessation programs in Medicaid. And you've seen the FDA using this new authority in the recently finalized rules that make it clear that its regulatory authority apply to products like e-cigarettes, along with restrictions on youth consumption. But what I'm going to focus on is the tax side of this and talk about 6 lessons that I think the world can draw from the US experience. The first lesson is that smoking plays a major role not just in mortality, but also in the inequality of mortality. There's recently been a substantial amount of attention to the fact that for middle-aged Americans, mortality inequality has increased, with people at the bottom of the income distribution actually seeing increases in their mortality rate while mortality goes down for people at the top of the income distribution. It turns out the true story is a little bit more complicated than that, and smoking plays an important role in that true story. If you look since 1950, mortality rates have fallen enormously, especially for heart attacks and strokes. The one exception to that was lung cancer, which tripled mortality rate from lung cancer between 1950 and 1990, at the same time that mortality from other cancers was falling. We've made some progress since 1990, but a lot of this has to do with smoking. Turns out the smoking changes are very unequal. So if you look at households above the age, people above the age of 50, the percentage of people that have ever smoked has consistently gone down for people above the poverty line, but consistently gone up for people below the poverty line. And this is one of the factors in that inequality of mortality of people at middle age. If you look at younger people, though, it's gone down for everyone, whether you're above the poverty line or below the poverty line. And that's why research has found the more favorable conclusion that if you look at life expectancy from birth, you actually see a reduction in inequality for life expectancy from birth. The second lesson from the United States is that price plays an important role in smoking. You can see suggestive evidence of this, and couldn't publish this anywhere, in the time series of prices and consumption for tobacco. Prices were roughly flat from 1954 to to about 1980, at the same time that per capita consumption was flat. Since then, prices have risen dramatically in inflation-adjusted terms. Consumption has fallen in inflation-adjusted terms. Of course, many things are going on here: public health campaigns, increased information, smoking cessation, and cultural shifts. But when economists have done more careful research controlling for all of those, they tend to find that the elasticity of smoking relative to price is between 0.3 and 0.7, which is to say a 10% increase in the price of cigarettes leads to a 3 to 7% reduction. And that reduction, roughly half of it comes from the extensive margin of fewer people smoking because they don't take up smoking in the first place, and about half of it comes from the intensive margin. For people who do smoke, it's more expensive, so they smoke less. And there's some evidence that all of these effects are larger for younger people. The third lesson is that cigarette taxes play an important role in cigarette prices. If you look at cigarette taxes in inflation-adjusted terms, they were constant for decades, that period during which the price of a pack of cigarettes was constant. And then they actually fell in real terms in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was partially reversed with a tax increase in 1983, and then substantially changed starting around 2000, both with federal tax increases and, as you heard from Philip, most states raising their taxes, in many cases by substantial margins as well, and then a master settlement agreement which had further fees that in many cases function effectively like taxes. All of this substantially driving up the price of cigarettes. The fourth lesson, which is really a corollary of lessons 1, 2, and 3, is that cigarette taxes have large aggregate benefits for public health. These estimates come from one of the two studies that I'm aware of that have been performed on the 2009 tax increase, the one from 39 cents to $1.01 a pack. And as you can see, it finds especially large effects for children aged 12 to 17, a 17% reduction in smoking initiation, a reduction in cigarettes per day for the people that are daily users, and smaller but still very large and meaningful reductions for somewhat older people as well. Taking these estimates and also looking at a range of elasticities from the literature that preceded the 2009 experience, I estimate that for each cohort of 18-year-olds, the smoking incidence will fall by between 45,000 and 220,000 people. That's a 3 to 15% reduction. And if you estimate that about 1/3 of smokers die prematurely as a result of smoking, that's 15 to 70,000 lives saved per year. We're nowhere near the optimal tax on cigarettes, and one way to think about this question is the cost of a pack of cigarettes to a person is the cost of producing that pack, a couple dollars, and the cost in terms of the shortened lifespan, mortality and other problems that person will have. That second cost is somewhere between $25 and $50 a pack. So let's say 25, use the low end of that range. You should smoke if it's worth paying $28 or so for that pack of cigarettes, the cost of the pack and the cost of the damage to yourself. There's a lot of evidence that people don't fully take into account those costs, what economists call an internality, because they're overly optimistic about the chances that they won't become addicted, or that if they do become addicted, that they'll quit. And as a result, they don't come close to taking that into account. That's one of the motivations for our proposal to double the federal tax that would save another 10 to 50,000 lives a year. The biggest objection that one gets is the claim that these types of excise taxes are regressive. That, however, gets it precisely backward, at least insofar as the excise taxes have positive benefits for the people that are facing them. The tax itself is, of course, regressive, and this is an estimate of the incidence of the 2009 tax increase by quintile, and it has the largest percentage reduction in income for the lowest quintile because you're more likely to smoke and it's a larger fraction of your income. But when you then add those health benefits, that $25 to $50 a pack I'm talking about, that reverses and it becomes not just progressive, but enormously progressive. Now, there's a real debate as we think about how to regulate or tax tobacco of to what degree you should take into account the utility and pleasure that smokers get from consuming a pack of cigarettes. One, I think, not unreasonable view is that we shouldn't take that into account at all because it's such a highly addictive thing that people greatly underestimate the addictiveness of. HHS has recently done an analysis, and for the sake of argument, I'm taking the high end of their range, applying what's called a 25% utility offset, assuming that there's some utility lost from reduced smoking. When you add that in, you get the gray bars, and it's still very progressive. The final thing, though, is all this money is going somewhere. It's not just being collected and, flushed down a hole. And in the case of the 2009 experience, it went to pay for health care for low-income children. And when we add that into the distributional table, it more than undoes that utility offset from tobacco and makes it even more progressive than it was at first. The final lesson is one that sounds a little bit more technical and in the weeds, but is actually quite important. And it's that it is really important to tax similar tobacco products at similar rates. Before 2009, the tax rate on tobacco that you would put in a pipe and a tobacco that you would roll into a cigarette was basically about the same. The 2009 legislation dramatically raised the tax rate on roll-your-own tobacco to $25 a pound, and the tax rate on pipe tobacco was $3 a pound. So there was a $20 a pound difference between the two, and surprise, surprise, price matters. You saw a large decline in roll-your-own tobacco and a large increase in the consumption of pipe tobacco. And the problem with that is it undoes a bunch of the health effect that you're trying to achieve with the higher tax. In the most extreme case, if you have perfect substitutes, which of course isn't the case, then all that matters is the lowest tax rate. And you can raise the tax rate on one product as much as you want, and you won't have any effect on public health. You have to raise them in a harmonized manner. You also saw something similar in the United States, by the way, with small cigars and light cigars, and large cigars. Large cigars were taxed more lightly, and you saw small cigar makers adding a tiny bit of weight so they could get above the threshold, and large differences there. When we were considering our new proposal for tobacco tax increases, we felt it was important to not just raise them, not just index them to inflation, but harmonize. And the analysis that we did at the time was that the effect for a given amount of revenue was 2.5 times larger if you did a harmonized tax increase than if you just raised taxes on cigarettes alone. In conclusion, I'd say all of these lessons are applicable to any country, developed or developing. In the case of developing countries, there's some evidence that there's even greater sensitivity of consumption to price. In many developing countries, harmonization is a really important first-order issue. And of course, in developing countries, in many cases, you have to overcome, however, problems in terms of governance and the efficiency of taxes. But these are problems that should be solved in order to achieve this goal, not a reason not to do it. Thank you.
Well, that was a fantastic presentation by Dr. Furman. So many thanks. And I think that the lessons of the United States are highly relevant for the developing countries, particularly because right now in different countries in the East Asia and the Pacifics that are becoming, that are growing rapidly, there is a great, the affordability of tobacco products has increased enormously. Therefore, they are facing an epidemic of tobacco consumption. So while the tobacco firms are being pushed out for the development market, they are finding a niche in the developing countries. And the developing countries, without the capacity, without the resources, are starting to face the consequences of ill health, premature mortality, and disability that was observed in the United States 3-4 decades ago. So now moving into the developing world, I would like to invite a good friend, colleague, Jeremias Paul, who up to a month ago, he was the Undersecretary of Finance in the Ministry of Finance of the Philippines and the architect of the landmark sin tax legislation in the Philippines that covers both alcohol and tobacco. Jeremias.
Yeah, good morning to everyone. Like what Professor Akerlof said, that we have to have a story, and I'm going to tell you the story of the Philippines in tax reform. It's a win-win for revenues and health. And here you can also apply the same lessons that were applicable in the recent presentation of Dr. Furman. My presentation is as follows. I'll give you a background, then I'll walk you through the wins of the sin tax reform and some concluding remarks. When the Aquino administration came into office in 2010, he had a social contract with the Filipino people, which included the provision of universal health care. He also had a promise of no new taxes. So it was very difficult because if there was no new taxes promise, how are you going to get away with that? And the World Bank country director then, Bert Hoffman, said, it's not a new tax, it's an old tax, you're just restructuring it. So that was essentially the way we went out of that promise, because it's not a new tax, it's an old tax, you're just restructuring it. And this is important because the Philippines is among the top smoking countries in Southeast Asia. Before the reform, we were really, tobacco taxes and prices were among the lowest in the world. We also have a very strong tobacco lobby with deep business and political connections. And in the past, the tobacco lobby has hindered previous excise tax increases. And to complicate it further, we had a case with the WTO wherein we had to restructure our excise taxes on alcohol. And we had a tight deadline to make it happen. We only had 1 year. So fighting two fronts, increasing taxes on tobacco and alcohol, was really a challenge, but with strategy, we were able to do it. And what's also important is the Philippines ratified the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is also one of the reasons why we pushed for higher taxes. What was the rationale for reform? To help finance the universal health care, to address public health issues relating to alcohol and tobacco consumption, and essentially from a finance perspective, to restructure the excise tax system on alcohol and tobacco products to fix long-standing structural weaknesses. So Republic Act number 10351, an act restructuring excise taxes on alcohol and tobacco products, was signed into law on December 19, 2012. It's a landmark legislation and the only revenue legislation under the Aquino administration. It's fundamentally a good governance measure with positive impact on both fiscal and public health. And incremental revenues were earmarked for health. Ordinarily, finance ministries are against earmarking, but for this particular case, we made an exception. So after deducting allocations for tobacco farmers, the balance of about 85% goes to universal health care, which is further broken down 80% for the National Health Insurance Program and attainment of the Millennium Development Goals, and 20% for medical assistance and health enhancement facilities program. So this is a tobacco tax reform path at a glance. If you notice, there were 4 tiers before, multi-tiered, and we essentially gone unitary. And the key principle here is that the health effect of a cheap cigarette is the same as the expensive cigarette. So we also substantially increased the tax rates in the lowest tier by 341%. That was really unheard of. One tobacco company described it as disruptive, and I agree it's disruptive to their profits. And also, after 2017, the tax rates will be indexed to inflation, and bulk of the incremental revenues, again, will be earmarked for health. And there are really safety nets for tobacco farmers and others. Historically, excise tax increases were gradual, but because we focus on health, this has been changed, which allowed us. What you have here is the weighted average tax rates per pack. So what were the key issues raised, which when you want to raise tobacco taxes in other countries, you will also hear this. In congressional deliberations, there were arguments that the raising tobacco taxes will reduce, not increase revenues. It will adversely affect tobacco farmers, will increase smuggling and illicit trade, will negatively impact the poor, will increase unemployment, and will destroy the local tobacco industry. I mean, these were the issues that we were confronted when we had to justify the increase in Congress. Just to give you an idea of the legislative process, the all-powerful in the House of Representatives, we had to go through the House of Representatives, then we go to the upper house, which is the Senate, then we go to the BICAM, and that would have to go to the Office of the President. But the tobacco industry controls the House Ways and Means Committee in both the House and the Senate. So this is really a particular challenge for us. That's why when we're talking of the wins of the sin tax reform, it was really a battle, and then we essentially managed to reach the finish line by only 1 vote in the Senate. But the win for revenues, I mean, in contrast to the predictions by the tobacco industry that we will lose revenues, on the contrary, the actual incremental revenues were higher than projected, so it was really a win for revenues. It's also a win for revenues in the sense that the sin tax law reversed the declining trend of tobacco and alcohol excise tax collections to GDP. So from 0.9%, it went down to 0.5% in 2012, and in 2015, it was 1.1% of GDP. And if you look at that, tobacco taxes accounted for bulk of the collections, with the share of tobacco excise tax collections highest at 2015. So the reversal is also there, the reversal of the declining trend. The sin tax law was a key condition for the rating agencies to upgrade the Philippines, So the sin tax law made possible the Philippines' first investment grade rating. That investment grade rating meant that our cost of borrowing in the international capital markets was going to be lower, and that essentially increased also the fiscal space. So essentially, it generated a virtuous cycle of more fiscal space. It's a win for public health because the public health budget, the Department of Health budget, almost tripled versus in 2012 levels. And who said you can't have your cake and eat it too? So the red one is the excise tax collections for tobacco, where the blue line represents really the consumption. So excise tax collections rose while the production went down. And what's really significant, the sin tax law increased the number of people with free health insurance from 5.2 million poor primary members in 2012 to about 15.4 million primary members in 2015, which if a primary member has 4 dependents, that's roughly 50% of the population. So you also see that skyrocketing increase in national government allocation for health insurance for the poor. And what about smoking prevalence? According to a smoking prevalence study by Dr. Antonio Dans of the University of the Philippines, based on the National Nutrition and Health Survey of 2013 and 2015, the prevalence of smoking among adult Filipinos went down from 31% in 2008 to 25.4% in 2013, and more recently to 23.3% in 2015. According to him, there are 4 million less smokers in the country because of the sin tax law. While the drop is partly from people who stop smoking, the smokers, it is mostly from people who avoid starting to smoke. And at least 70,000 deaths have averted since 2013. In conclusion, the sin tax reform has generated about $3.9 billion in incremental revenues in its first year, 3 years of implementation, with about 80% accounted for by tobacco taxes. Indeed, raising tobacco taxes is a low-lying fruit for raising domestic revenues for health, and in particular in the attainment of the SDGs. In the case of the Philippines, earmarking revenues for health has almost tripled the health budget over 2012 levels, and allowed the Philippine government to provide free health insurance to the poor and the near poor, which is roughly the bottom 40% of the population. It also allowed free health insurance for senior citizens. We must aim high for health. Framing the sin tax as a health measure allowed the Philippines to raise tobacco taxes substantially than otherwise possible if it was framed as a revenue measure. Again, political support at the highest level is important. And it's also important that we, as is shown in the experience of the Philippines, we did collaborate. Finance, health, and other ministries essentially had sung to the same tune, and we essentially coordinated, collaborated also with civil society. But of course, we need to be constantly vigilant and systematically monitor progress and outcomes. In the case of the Philippines, we're monitoring using the use of technology. We use tax stamps, and with the help of the World Bank, we have employed a firm essentially to monitor the compliance to the tax stamps, and it's about 98 to 99% compliance. In ending, I'd like to give an English translation of the speech of the President Aquino during the signing of the sin tax law in 2012. Many thought it was impossible to pass the sin tax reform bill. The enemy is strong, loud, and organized, and has deep pockets. But as we have proven time and again, nothing is impossible with the Filipino people rowing in one direction, heart in the right place, and ready to stand up for its principles. Thank you very much.
Well, with the change in government expected to take place at the beginning of July, we have received all the indications are that the incoming government will keep this reform, is very keen in pushing this reform further in order to support the expansion of the health insurance program in the Philippines. So perhaps that's very good news. So colleagues, now I would like to invite Professor Ross Shane from the Beijing University to present the Chinese experience. As you know, China is the largest producer of tobacco leaves, but also the larger consumer of tobacco. More than 300 million people smoke in that country. So with it, and a further complication, tobacco production is a state monopoly. So within that context, let's hear what has been achieved over the last 12 months. Ross?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for World Bank, especially Patricio, for having me in this exciting tax forum. Yesterday, I learned a lot about the progress of international taxation. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank for WHO Tobacco Control Economic Team and Chinese Ministry of Finance, Excise Tax Policy Team. My presentation is part of the work with these brilliant colleagues. I'm going to address the following aspects about the tobacco tax reform happened last year. And we know that China is the world's largest producer and consumer of tobacco products. And the tobacco industry is regulated by a state-owned monopoly. The China National Tobacco Corporation is a state-owned enterprise who produced about 89 cigarette family brands, and each brand has a multiple variety differing in terms of the price, packaging, and the quality. So as a result, there are about 870 different cigarettes available in the market. And the cigarette's price is incredibly low, that varying from about $0.4 US to $16 US per pack. The tobacco tax reform happened last year. Happened at the wholesale level, that the tax rate has been raised from 5% to 11%, and a specific tax of 0.1 RMB was introduced at the wholesale level. Along with the tax increase, the monopoly announced its pricing policy. That is, all the cigarettes' wholesale price is going to be increased by 6%. And it's also the first time that the monopoly allows the provincial branches to set up the retail price based on the local markets. Both the tax policy and the price policy took effective from the May of 2015. China's tobacco structure covers from the agriculture to the produce to the commercial segment. So we have tobacco leaf tax, we have VAT, we have excise tax at both the producer level and the wholesale level. And besides of these taxes, we also have two other small taxes. The tax base of these two small taxes is the VAT tax amount and the excise tax amount. So it's actually taxes imposed on the taxes. So it's a little bit of trick here. This formula describes the pricing mechanism of cigarettes in China. One notable thing in this formula is that except for the VAT, we can't see any other taxes being reflected in this formula. That's because this tax is something like the cost for the producers and the wholesalers, which can be deducted from the corporate income tax. So this feature makes the tobacco monopoly very easy to manipulate the cigarette's price by adjusting the profit margin at each segment. That's what happened in 2009 tax reform, when with the excise tax rate increased, but there's no change with the wholesale price and the retail price. In the past few years, under the leadership of the WHO Tobacco Control Economic Group, we developed a taxing model based on China's tax structure and the market structure. All our analysis is based on this model. So what's the impact of the tax reform so far? First, let's look at the impact on price. The retail price has been increased by 10%. So the weighted average retail price is about $2 per pack. Specifically, the cheapest cigarettes has been increased the most by 20%, while the middle price cigarettes, which has the largest market share, has been increased the least by 5%. This is the result of the tobacco industry's pricing strategy, which they intended to have the least impact on this category. The tax as a percentage of retail price. Now the current tax as a percentage of retail price is 56%, has been increased by 4%. The excise tax as a percentage of the retail price has been increased from 35% to 39%. Structurally, we can see that the premium cigarettes has higher tax incidence than the middle and cheap cigarettes. That's because there's tiered tax rates at the producer level, that the high-priced cigarettes has higher tax rates than the middle and the lower cigarettes. This figure shows for selected Asian countries of the tax as a percentage of the retail price. We can see that in this region, the Philippines and Thailand has reached the WHO requirement of 75%, while the other countries, including China, and we can see Vietnam is only 41%, comparatively lower than many of the European countries. So what's the impact on consumption? When we did the policy simulation, we used an empirical price elasticity of -0.4, so with which we have an expected revenue generated from the tax reform. The right column is the actual data published by the tobacco monopoly, which indicates that the tobacco consumption has been decreased by 2.4%. Considering that this data is released at the end of the 2015, that it only covers for 7 months, so we recently updated the calculation covering 12 months from the May of 2015 to the March of this year to compare with the same period of the previous year. And the result is that the tobacco consumption has been decreased by 3.3%. The impact on the market structure. This figure compares the market structure between 2015 and 2014, and we can see that the high-priced cigarettes market share has been increased, while the middle and lower price cigarettes has been decreased. This is the result of the tobacco monopoly's brand promotion strategy in the past 10 years. We can see from 2007, the middle and upper price cigarettes market share has been expanding, while the cheap cigarettes market share has been shrinking. But this tendency has been diverted by the tax reform. In the first 3 months of this year, the middle and upper price cigarettes market share has been reduced by 24%, while the cheapest cigarettes market share has been increased by 6%. This can indicate that the smokers has been switching down with the price and tax increase. The impact on government's revenue. The tax reform brings the central government additional about $11 billion of the tobacco tax. Because the tobacco industry is 100% state-owned, so the industry also needs to contribute its profit to the central government upon request. So in 2015, the industry contributed about $168 billion to the central government. So in the conclusion that the tax reform brought multiple wins. The tobacco tax increased by 9%. The industry's profit before the income tax increased by 8%. And the central government revenue from the industry increased by 21%. The cigarettes price is incredibly low. So there's no doubt that we'll keep increase the tobacco tax in the future. We're also trying to persuade the central government to introduce the taxation management into the excise tax policy. China is now undergoing a VAT reform. This reform makes the central government lose about 500 million RMB. So the central government needs more revenue from the tobacco industry. It's estimated that the central government expects about $181 billion from the industry this year. So it's really sad to see that our government get addicted from the industry's revenue. There are many challenges for using tobacco tax as an effective tobacco control measures, because in many cases, especially when the economic growth is slowing down, the governments pay more attention on revenue than on public health. There are some other issues that the policymakers pay attention, like the tobacco farmers, the employment, the low-income group. So we need more research to provide supportive evidence data to the policymaker. Tobacco industry is very powerful in China. The monopoly itself is government, so it's not unusual to see that the tax policymakers and the monopoly administrators sitting together discussing about the tobacco tax reform. So for the next tax reform, it's very important to have fiscal experts and public health experts to play a leading role to ensure that the next reform is for the good of public health. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thanks. One ray of hope in China is that the population, as a result of the one-child policy, is growing older. But as differing from its competitors, the Chinese population is growing older but sicker. So this is a message that we have been able to convey to the central government in China, and they are worried mainly because the economic active population is also shrinking. And those that are active are prone to smoke, and they are seriously afflicted by tobacco-related illnesses. So that's something that they are starting to be mindful, mainly because it affects it will affect negatively their economic performance. So with that, I would like to finish, to invite our last presenter, Fernando Serra, the advisor, the tax advisor at the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Uruguay, to present his views on the impact of one of the most successful tax reform, tobacco control experiences in the world, including tax reform, but also there is a peculiarity in the case of Uruguay. Peculiarity has been taken to court by one of the leading tobacco producers on the basis of arguments that it has violated some international laws.
I will speak in Spanish.
So please move to channel 3.
Muchas gracias a todos, en particular.
I'd like to thank you all, and in particular Patricio, for this invitation. It is a major responsibility to be the last speaker after such a distinguished panel and such distinguished presentations. In the case of Uruguay, I'd like to tell you about our experience based on what happened in the past 10 years in attempting to control consumption of tobacco products. Although there is a certain level of consensus on the panel, and in particular having to do with the assumptions used by the Uruguayan state to develop its own strategy, when saying that excise taxes help combat the consumption of tobacco products. In the Uruguayan case, we believe that the approach had to be comprehensive, and therefore a set of actions were put in place based on the framework agreement for the control of tobacco products, ratified in 2004 by Law 17,793. So based on adoption or approval of this law, a number of regulations were put in place to control the tobacco market, and a couple of norms were also created to control tobacco consumption, and we're now going to see the outcomes of implementation of this measure 10 years forward. In 2006, based on a regulatory decree that provided that in any closed public area, smoking was forbidden, and there was an announcement made about 100% tobacco-free spaces. Uruguay thus became the first country in Latin America in declaring 100% free of tobacco smoke. The goal was dual. On the one hand, the quality of air, and two, the protection of passive smokers. That same year, 2005, all of these instruments based on the taking over of the presidency by Tabaré Vázquez, who is an oncologist, all of these measures were implemented using decree orders from the executive. That same year, 2005, it was determined that a cigarette pack had to contain a legend saying that smoking can lead to cancer, pulmonary disease, and heart disease, and that smoking during pregnancy can harm the child. That same year, there was yet another decree providing for the prohibition of having cigarette commercials during the time protecting children, because, after all, the tobacco industry seeks and targets those under 18 because they are on the belief that smoking begins at an early age. So Uruguay is seeking a number of actions here, aiming that in 2025, 2030, to have the first generations of non-smokers. Another decree in 2005 prohibits the cigarette families. In other words, the basis was that cigarette consumption is absolutely harmful regardless of any qualities advertised, and therefore no reference can be made to ultralight, light, and other cigarette families. So cigarette families are prohibited, and a single presentation is the only thing that is now allowed. In 2008, all of these decrees that had been criticized pretty harshly are covered by regulation in order to give them more power. This is through Law 18,256, enacted in 2008. Once again, it was declared that public use closed spaces had to be 100% smoke-free, and furthermore, all advertising was forbidden, especially messages linking cigarette use with well-being, pleasure, happiness, and other virtues. In that same year, 2008, it was indicated that the health warning on the cigarettes had to at least cover 80% of the physical space on a box, on both sides of the box. So the warning had to take up 80% of these two sides of the box. In 2014, another law was enacted prohibiting advertising at the point of sale, and also forbidding the exhibition to the public and sale of products. In other words, cigarettes and tobacco products have to be in places that cannot be seen by the public. Lastly, in 2014, another law is enacted. The Parliament of the Republic approved the protocol for elimination of illegal trade in tobacco products, and an interministerial commission was created to develop the strategy. The understanding is that the cigarette price should not have an impact on the obtention of illegal products. What this law did was generate an interministerial area that could focus on the illegal trade of tobacco and its products. So all of this has to do with the regulation of the tobacco consumption market. Let me now turn to the tax regulations. The first measure adopted by President Tabaré Vázquez when he took office was to raise tax on tobacco products to the maximum legal amount. At that time, taxation was about 68.8%. The legal maximum was 70%. So the first measure adopted by the president was to increase tax to 70%. Then, after reforming the tax system in 2007, the tax schedule for tobacco products was changed with two bases. First, rather surprisingly, and historically, tobacco products did not have a VAT tax. There was a rationale to avoid tax accumulation, and since it had a specific tax already, it didn't have to apply VAT. The reform of the tax system made it then possible to also tax tobacco products with VAT. Now, with regards to excise tax on tobacco products, the tax up to that point had been ad valorem excise tax, and this generated a problem. Before the multinationals appeared, in other words, when the tobacco industry was in the hand of domestic companies, there was a gentleman's understanding between the government and industry so as to not decrease the tax contribution, the excise tax, on any basis. When the multinationals appeared, a price war and predatory attitudes was unleashed to eliminate national or domestic producers, and through price manipulation, the tax basis was decreased. The problem here is that with an ad valorem framework, with a tax that is about 2/3 of the excise tax, whenever industry reduced the price, the state contributed to the war price by 2/3. In other words, the state was financing that internal war to eliminate competition. Under the new tax system, the excise tax was modified, and it was moved from a fixed specific basis plus an ad valorem element. Through this specific basis, there is a direct impact on price, and the tobacco industry has no further control over price fixing, but it is guided by the specific basis that is set by the executive branch. As you may see, through different decrees, excise tax was increased based on this specific value, and the increase was about 30 to 35% in nominal terms. In other words, the excise tax increase was quite significant. In terms of tax-free shops, there is a reduced value at the border shops, and it was made homogeneous. There was a kind of internal contraband on tobacco purchases from purchases at the tax-free shops into the regular domestic market. I'd now like to briefly focus on the outcomes over the past 10 years since the reform of the excise tax schedule as applied to tobacco and its products and its impact on the market. Since 2005 until 2005, the general prevalence dropped from 33.5% to 22%. When it comes to young people under 18, the prevalence dropped from 22.8% to 8.2%. All of these measures obviously meant a reaction of the tobacco industry, and in 2010, a claim was filed by the tobacco industry, in particular by the one whose initials appear on this slide. Philip Morris, in other words, or PMI. And it was a claim filed under the agreement of investment protection with Switzerland. In other words, a tobacco company with their headquarters in another country can use this agreement in order to file a claim requesting an arbitral award from the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID. The claim was based on the prohibition of families on cigarette packs and having now only a single presentation, and the harm caused on consumption as well as the new tax laws applicable to tobacco. When it comes to taxes, the actions of this international tobacco country is that the increase in the tax rate does not have an impact on public health. That is one of the key arguments that they made with regards to taxation. Furthermore, they say that there has been a substitution effect on consumption when consumption is now focusing on the products obtained illegally. When the tobacco industry looks at this, it does not look at the internal substitution effect of moving from cigarette to using cut or leaf tobacco. So there is no scientific basis for this statement made by the tobacco industry, and the decreases that they noted are within the margin of error of the statistical samples. Let me now focus on the actions that the Uruguayan state should follow. We said that since the creation of this Commission for Implementation of the Protocol for Elimination of Illegal Trade of Tobacco Products, we are designing traceability in order to monitor the cigarette market, the generic packaging, the single packaging per brand, is what is now called the clear or plain packaging with no distinctions, and the granting of licenses for sales. Lastly, the message conveyed a few days ago by the President of the Republic that regardless of the award to be determined in the coming days, possibly in June by ICSID, Uruguay, in any event, is going to continue with this policy, taking head-on the tobacco industry and consumption of tobacco products. Thank you.
Well, colleagues, you have to forgive me, but we have run out of time, and actually by a large amount. And now we don't have time for questions and answers. You have to forgive me, I am mea culpa, but I would like to invite you for coffee, but more importantly, for the signing of 2 books. The latest book by Professor Akerlof on Fishing for Fools, and also the signing by Professor Cook of his book, Paying the Tab. I think those 2 books, for those of us who are working in terms of using this type of measures for public health purposes, are critical in order to strengthen our arguments. So many thanks to our distinguished panelists. Please join me with the applause. And many thanks to you, those who are in the audience, and those who participated via webcast. Yes, and please return to this auditorium at 11:15. So you have exactly 25 minutes, and the next session is a very interesting one. It's on taxing, on carbon taxes. Thanks.